many countries who already have targets for renewable energy. Some are higher targets, other not so high targets, but altogether 166 countries have national targets for renewable energy in the power sector. Depending on the country, we have some with very high or sometimes even 100% renewable energy targets, which quite often means 100% renewable electricity targets and actually not energy, like we see in Costa Rica, where small countries have those high targets, but also as we have experienced just recently that China, for example, announced net zero by 2060. So, and Japan did announce net zero by 2050. So we have many targets. That means the electricity supply, next slide please, will actually change, because currently we have 23% renewable electricity worldwide. So more than 70% are still non-renewable electricity, mainly fossil. But if we would have looked at that statistics only like 10, 15 years ago, we would have only hydropower as renewable electricity with around 16%. And that was the case, sort of 16% renewable electricity based on hydropower was in a statistic over decades without any change. That has changed tremendously in the last few years. Wind power actually appeared first time in the global statistics about 10 years ago, solar PV more recently, and now we have every year more and more wind and solar photovoltaics, which actually have higher shares on renewable electricity, and I'm sure we won't have to wait another 10 years to see double-digit percentage of solar and wind. That means, next slide, that our electricity market will change. We have more and more variable solar and wind power generation. Just to make sure we use the right term, solar and wind electricity is variable, not fluctuating. Fluctuation means it's sort of unpredictable. It is not unpredictable. The sunrise never comes as a surprise, nor does the sunset. And wind and solar forecasts now are quite exact. So we have variable renewable electricity supply with higher and higher shares, and that requires a different grid. And grids are important for an energy transition, and that's basically our session today. I give you a little overview before we jump straight into the first session. In the first presentation, we first have a presentation from Antina Sander from the Renewables Grid Initiative. She's a deputy CEO and based in Berlin. Then we have an overview about sort of the planning process on the EU side in terms of what the civil society is engaged with, from Wendel Trier from Climate Action Network Europe, and from Patrick ten Brink from European Environmental Bureau. And then we have some presentations about case studies from Australia, from Natasha Sinkler from AMO, from Japan, from Teruo Ono from TEPCO Power, and from the European perspective from NGOs. From there, we jump into a breakout group and discuss the civil engagement in grid planning, and then we wrap up in about 2 hours. All right, that's from my side. I would like to again introduce Antina Sander. She's Deputy CEO of the Renewable Grid Initiative. And I think without any exaggeration, Antina is probably one of the best informed persons knowing what's going on in Europe about grids, not just in Europe. So Antina, I hand over to you, and I'm pretty sure I can learn a lot.
Can you hear me now? Thanks a lot for the introduction, Sven. It's nice to see you, even though you're on the other side of this globe right now. Yeah, as said, my name is Antina Sander. The name of my organization is Renewables Grid Initiative. And what I'm going to talk about is the role of infrastructure and the importance of collaborative planning. If you hear some weird background noises, they are doing roof works and there is a bit of drilling every now and then. Don't be surprised, it's not your computer. I hope it doesn't happen in the next 15 minutes. Next slide, please. Most of you will not know what the Renewables Grid Initiative is. Therefore, this is who we are in many logos. What you see on the left-hand side is all logos of European electricity transmission system operators. What you see on the right-hand side is logos of European umbrella or nationally active within European countries, NGOs, either with a climate or a nature focus. This group of organizations has been collaborating since 2009 to look into how to get the grid built, which is needed for an increase of renewables in the system, and how to do this respecting nature and taking care of legitimate societal concerns. So for you to understand which organization and through this, which worldview I represent. Next slide, please. What I would like to take you home is 3 key messages, which is actually what this entire day is about. The first one is that, as Sven has already explained in his introductory note, if we want to reach really high shares of renewables, we need to think about infrastructure planning and especially about grid planning. The second one is that scenario development, which is the starting point to grid planning, needs to be an ambitious and collaborative exercise of many stakeholders. And the third one is that of these many stakeholders, civil society is a particularly important one. So let's start with the why of my first message. If we want to reach high shares of renewables, why do we need grids? Next slide, please. Actually, the next one straight away as well. I'm going to tell this story from a European background perspective. Sven just mentioned I'm sitting in Berlin, and the Renewables Grid Initiative is active in Europe. But this message is transferable to, I would say, the vast majorities of geographies around this globe. But just to give you a bit of an idea, the situation in Europe is that variable renewables are really on the rise. This pie chart shows where the money has been put in the last years, the investment in newly installed capacity. The yellow color is solar PV, the blue color is wind. So you can see really the new investments are into variable renewables. And indeed, next slide, please. If you look at this chart taken from the latest global status report of REN21, where they show the countries that have reached more than 20% of electricity from variable renewables. 7 of these countries are European countries. Again, you can see the split between solar and wind, yellow and blue. And there is some more encouraging achievements. Next slide, please. And ambitions, I would say as well. Next slide. Yeah, super. That I wanted to share. I just picked some of them randomly that I had on top of my head. For example, the United Kingdom for the first quarter of 2020 reported 47% of variable renewables in the electricity system. That is about double the bar that you just saw on the previous slide. Portugal news showed in this summer that they had run the country for 50 days in a row without putting on any coal power plant. And what regards, this is the drill now, what regards the encouraging ambitions, for example, the government of Ireland has announced that by 2030, they want that 70% of electricity comes from renewables, or 50 Hertz, which is one of the German transmission system operators, 2 months ago had a press release saying, we want to be by 100% renewables by 2032. Next slide, please. This one I show you to start. There may be, I don't know if there was a box around, doesn't matter. To start the transition towards why grids are so important. What you see here is for all the European countries, the generation profiles. So again, yellow is the sun, blue is wind, green is hydrogen, and the other colors are other stuff. What is important here to see is that when you look from one country to the other within Europe, you have very different generation profiles. And this is important when you think about renewables and when you think about grids. Because, and Sven has mentioned this before, next slide, please. One of the reasons that when you talk about renewables, you need to think about grids is that grids help you to smooth out variable generation. So in the situation that you have wind blowing somewhere, but the sun not shining somewhere else, you can bridge gaps by transporting the electricity over quite large distances and balance out these variations. Also, where the progress of increasing renewable generation capacities has been quite successful, these high concentrations of renewables plant can cause rather rapid changes in generation. Not unexpected, Sven said this before, it's not unexpected, but it happens. If the weather patterns change very quickly, you can have steep increases or decreases, and then again, you can balance this out if you're connected via a strong grid, and you can either transport the electricity that you are lacking all of a sudden from somewhere else, or you can export it. There's also other reasons why grids are extremely useful. For example, very often the highest renewables potential is far away from where the consumption is. The most placative example is offshore wind. The best renewables generation sites in Europe are in the sea. This is not where the demand is. From an economical perspective, usually the further you go away from human settlements, the cheaper the ground and the cheaper to put up renewable generation sites and larger plants, which also usually are cheaper. Open parenthesis, I do not want to say that decentralized solutions are not very important, but we know that we need it all. And in the case of these larger plants further away from load centers, grids are extremely useful. So in sum, grids are very useful, A, to balance local variability, and B, to really make full use of the generating capacity that you have. So that was the first message. When you think renewables, why do you need to think grids? Let's move on to scenario development, which needs to be ambitious and also a collaborative exercise of many stakeholders. Next slide, please. This little sketch shows basically the steps that lead to determining investment priorities from a grid perspective. What you usually do is you start with a storyline which describes in a qualitative way what type of generation and what type of consumption you foresee for a certain point in time in the future. And this high-level storyline then is converted into data, into figures about the when and where of future supply and demand, the cost of CO2, of different fuel sources, of different technologies, their assumed efficiencies. This data is fed into a market model, which usually optimizes from a cost perspective how a foreseen demand can be met in the best way from a cost perspective by a given supply. And then the grid model looks into this foreseen demand and supply and checks whether the existing infrastructure is sufficient to actually transport the electricity from the supply side to the demand side, or whether there are bottlenecks where hence you need to invest in grids. Now, looking at the ambitions, next slide, please, of the Paris Agreement and the wish to halt climate change, evidently these scenarios need to be ambitious, but also they need to bring together a wide variety of proficiencies, which are usually not located all within one organization. And these little bubbles just give you some of them. It's not meant to be a comprehensive list. How are we going to travel for work, for leisure in the future? How smart and efficient are our buildings going to be? Will we have new chemical processes for heavy industry, or will we perhaps electrify parts of this? All these new technologies, will they be efficient, cost efficient? Are they really desirable, all of them? Where will the energy come from? Do we produce right at home? Do we produce within our own country, continent? Do we import from somewhere else? Which role can biofuels actually play? Is it fair to calculate in negative emissions? And on and on and on and on. All of this should be reflected by a scenario somehow. And to pull this information together, you need to talk to many different smart people. The reason you really want to work with solid scenarios, next slide please, is also manifold. Of course, there is no right scenario, but you want to have good scenarios that help you understand the different options and what they mean. And the reason for this is, amongst others, to increase legitimacy about the investment decisions that you take in the end. We come to this in a moment once more. Of course, also to give certainty to investors to put their money in the right place, to give certainty to society that you are building the right assets and that you avoid stranded investments or a fossil lock-in. You don't want to build anything more that is needed also from a perspective of optimizing the spatial and natural resources. Space is a massive issue in many places by now. You may have to adjust, you certainly have to adjust market and regulatory frameworks to provide a level playing field to different generation technologies in many places. And of course, also from a investor perspective or an operator perspective, you need to think of the really long times of realizing new projects. So you rather want to plan in the right direction. So this is in sum why you need to think about scenarios in a diligent way and as a multi-stakeholder exercise. Third message, next slide, please. The importance of civil society and why it is important to involve civil society. Next slide, please. These, not there yet. Have you clicked? These are
yes, it could be a connection issue.
Yeah, now it's there, thanks. These are all photographs from different countries in Europe related to people protesting against pylons and power lines. I know from many conversations with people who are not from Europe that protests are not a European phenomenon. That happens around the world. Wherever this type of infrastructure is meant to be built, people are concerned. What we have observed here over the years is that the quality of questions that people ask has changed. Next slide, please. When I started looking into this topic, the most common pushback was a local pushback that said, do we really need to build this here? Can we perhaps not go underground? Perhaps if we save more energy, we don't need a new line. Today, people ask, do we really need this if the system was smarter? Do we really need it if it was properly coupled with other sectors? Could we not avoid this if there was more storage? What if we build a really decentralized system? All of these questions have to be answered. Next slide, please. Because if you don't have scenarios that provide answers to these questions, so if you don't get the storylines and the scenarios right, people will not respect the results of the modeling that then leads into the actual realization of projects. And this is one of the reasons why ever since RGI started, the RGI NGOs have requested the TSO partners, you should be working with more ambitious scenarios, which took quite a time to realize. Next and last slide. For the past 2 years, we've had the opportunity to start working more specifically in this direction. And this is actually the umbrella under which also this event takes place. The PAC project, Paris Agreement Compatible Scenarios for Energy Infrastructure, is a collaboration of REN21, who you all know, my organization, and 2 big European NGO umbrella organizations, the European Environmental Bureau and the Climate Action Network Europe. They are going to talk to you in a bit. And what we have done is we have scrutinized the scenarios that the European Network for Transmission System Operators, that is a mandatory network that has to do for the European perspective grid planning. And you are also going to hear something about this as far as I know later on today. To provide feedback to this organization, also to develop an own scenario, we'll hear about this later, to learn how to actually do this as a multi-stakeholder exercise, and to share our insights with a broader community, which is what we are doing here today. And with this, I come to the end. I hope this was an insightful introduction for you, and wishing you a good and insightful day. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Bye-bye. You're still muted, Sven.
Yep, thanks, Santina. That was really good on the point, on the dot. I have a question for you. I don't have any other from the audience, so I'll start with a question. Do you have, or do you see a different situation now where Europe talks a lot about hydrogen? Has that an impact on the grid debate?
Yes, because for many years it was an electricity grid discussion and no one spoke about gas. And I would say for the last 1.5, 2 years, everyone is realizing it's an energy system and you cannot separate one from the other. I just mentioned this European network of transmission system operators. When they were established, there was one network, there still is, for electricity TSOs, one for gas TSOs, who did their 2 completely different grid planning exercises. For a while now, they have been asked to do their scenarios together. This is a bumpy road, but the recognition is there that it does not make sense to do this first step of the planning exercise as separate exercises. And then there is, of course, a lot of discussion whether electrification or more hydrogen is the better way forward. We have a very strong opinion that electricity is much more efficient than hydrogen, but that's a different part of the story, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a different webinar. Yes. Just check if we have other questions in the chat. Not yet, I think. No. Actually, we are on the minute. We have 1 minute left.
There is someone asking, are there changing opinions in the public about international grids and buying from neighbors? I'm not sure that there is changing opinion, but there is very different opinions between whether Europe should try to be energy independent or whether import will be part of the equation no matter what. And that's, of course, between being at the technology forefront. There's words, terminologies like energy colonialism versus geopolitical stability, where you say it's also a peace measure to import energy. There's concerns about, can you actually be sure that the supply chain of imported energy is sustainable? So it's part of the debate, but I would not say that there is a very strong opinion in either one or the other direction from different communities. I don't think so. There's an understanding that this needs to be much better understood on many different levels.
All right, thank you very much. I think that's a perfect segue to the next speakers, which focuses on the engaging civil society input for grid planning processes and their experiences in this project. And as a first speaker, I would like to welcome Wendel Trio from the Climate Action Network Europe organization. I think Wendel has altogether about, I would say, 150 or 200 years of experience with climate negotiations and renewable energy and energy. I think you're in very good hands. Wendel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sven. Thank you also for your very kind introduction. Thank you for allowing me to address you briefly about what we have been doing as NGOs in developing a scenario on how we look at the energy future, including on grid planning. Can you go to the next slide? Just for introduction, Can Europe, Climate Action Network Europe is a European umbrella organization of NGOs working specifically on climate and energy policies. The EEB, European Environmental Bureau, looks at the broader environment issues, including climate change. Me and Patrick have divided this presentation. We will talk about 5 issues. First of all, the process of engaging. Secondly, our engagement around the TYNDP, the 10-year network development plan. Kind of the outcomes of our scenario. What are the policy implementation implications of that, and the next steps. You can maybe go to the next slide, please. So as NGOs, we strongly feel that the Paris Agreement that was made now almost 5 years ago, December 2015, really forms the backbone of international climate policy, and we strongly support the engagement that countries have made to try to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. We see that as extremely crucial if we want to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change. I think we all know we can't avoid all of the impacts because these are already happening, and they might be a bit on the background now because of the COVID pandemic, but we know that forest fires, droughts, extreme weather events, etc., they keep on happening. And despite the fact that countries made this commitment to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, we are still heading towards temperature rise of at least 3 degrees with the current individual pledges that governments have made. And it's good to see that a number of countries are discussing or have even decided to go further than what they planned 5 years ago, but still much more is needed. And that's why we as NGOs have been calling upon the EU to increase the ambition of its climate action, to achieve climate neutrality already by 2040, rather than what was agreed to do it by 2050, to go for 100% renewables by 2040, and to have emission reductions of at least 65% by 2030. Now, when we say that, of course, decision makers often say to NGOs, yes, okay, that's fine, but how are you aiming to do that? And so kind of challenging NGOs to identify the kind of energy transition that we want to see, with including the policies and finance that would be needed, but also looking at the infrastructure. And this is where we have been in conversation with the transmission system operators, both those for energy and those for electricity and those for gas, who together make this regular review of their 10 years national development plans. And it is in that process that we wanted to engage as NGOs through what is called the PAC scenario, through identifying the kind of how do we see this transition happening and what impact does it have on infrastructure planning in Europe. Next slide. We did this through a collective process that involved the experts in our own networks. And as I said, we are networks of about over 300 NGOs in Europe together, and there's lots of expertise within the NGO community on specific issues of the energy transition. But we also worked with quite a lot of research centers and scientific institutions to look at what they have been developing as proposals for the energy transition in Europe. And all of that information we brought together in a number of workshops where we collectively discussed input on each of the different elements of the transition, but of course continued that conversation in between the different workshops with webinars and online communication tools, etc., etc. And all of that kind of brought together a range of information whereby we had input like on efficiency from the Fraunhofer Institute that has been doing excellent work on how to reduce energy consumption in Europe, On renewables, we worked with the Energy Watch Group and the Lund University in Finland. On the industrial decarbonization, we had the material from material economics from the London School of Economics, and we used the Berlin University work on the economic recovery to fund the transition and so on. So a whole range of pieces of work that we brought together. Next slide, please. In a coherent scenario, looking at kind of what the different elements, the energy demand reduction, the supply capacity, and how that influences emissions in the EU and so on. We brought all of that together into one scenario that we also had a modeling exercise through the Eco Institute to see whether it actually really could function. All of that made it very clear that if we are to have an energy transition that is just and fair, but also looks at the ecological boundaries, that there's certain elements of infrastructure that will be needed, but Patrick will speak more about that. Next slide, please. So all of that, yes, so this further includes some of the resources that we used for the PAC scenario, and as Patrick will identify, we did indeed we indeed were able to develop a scenario that was in line with our objectives of 100% renewables by 2040 and emission reductions of at least 65% by 2030. Next slide, please. So the original proposal of the work was to influence also the work of ENSO-E and ENSO-G in developing their 10-year network development plans. Did we succeed? Not completely. Our original hope was for the TYNDP to include a scenario that would be similar to the one that we have developed. We are not that far yet, but it's very clear that in their TYNDP process, NGOs have now much more engaged, that the NSOs also have seen NGOs much more as a partner that does have the capacity to really think about the details of the TYNDP, and we have been able to at least challenge the NSOs to take on board a number of the issues that we have been proposing. This includes the concept of a carbon budget, although we different on the size of that budget. But definitely the project did bring NGOs and NSOEs together in a conversation and have more NGOs think about infrastructure, TYNDP, etc. Although we have to admit that these issues are still not mainstream in the work of NGOs. And I would now give the floor to Patrick. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Wendell, can I have the next slide, please? So I'm Patrick ten Brink. I'm the EU Director of the European Environmental Bureau, an NGO, 160 members. My first job 30 years ago was actually on electricity and energy sector modeling and scenario development. So it's 30 years later we come to this, which is very, very interesting. And I remember the whole concept of scenarios is to have all the different possible extremes to help test whether your understanding is fit for purpose. So when we're discussing around the TYNDPs and their scenarios didn't have a single one that was a purely 100% renewable. So for me, 30 years after understanding that scenarios are supposed to look at the extremes to test it, we realize that people are not using them in the same way as they should. And so we still believe that there's space to look at 100% renewables, and then you can pick it apart if you want. But before we pick it apart, I want to say what it is. And we're not going to go into all the details, but I thought I'd share a few of the results. So this is the picture of the synthesis synthesis of the energy demand over the period to 2050. I mean, you can see the reduction in the tertiary sector, the residential sector, a little bit of reduction in agriculture, transport going down, a little bit of industry going down by less. So these are all a range of different measures have led to that, whether it's efficiency gains, energy efficiency, demand measures, innovation, eco-design, and so on and so forth. But this is basically, and demand side measures, but this is basically the picture that we see as possible and necessary to reach the various different ambitions. One is 65% and 100% renewables. So next slide, please. So if you then say, well, okay, what does that mean in terms of the fuels? Well, of course, we're stepping out of coal, stepping away from coal, moving beyond fossil, and we see very much a future of electrification. We do have some renewable hydrogen, and of course the debate is hugely well, it's not controversial. Well, it is controversial. It's controversial and vibrant at the moment. Our view is that there's an important space for renewable hydrogen, but it's a smaller space than some. That's based on ideas of transformation efficiencies and so on. So we very much have a view of electricity-based future. Bioenergy ourselves, we think it's a smaller role because there's some sustainability concerns. We don't give a big space for nuclear or indeed for CCS because each of these have both economic limits and as well as risk limits. So our future is very much an electricity-based future with some elements around heat pumps and renewables and a tiny bit of bioenergy. Next slide, please. And of course, the question then comes as to where we're going to get all the renewables from. So we see it very much wind onshore and offshore is the big growth area, and solar PV even more. And that's basically our vision as to the future, with still, of course, some hydro and some geothermal, but certainly no nuclear or fossil fuels. So we go to the next slide. Please. And then, of course, a big question that's always targeted at people saying 100% renewables is how do we keep the lights on? So we've looked at different measures to see how that could be done. So you have the flexible fossil fuel power plants, grid extension, dispatch renewables, demand responses, and storage, and all together can be used to ensure that the lights are on. Of course, the big question is, where do you need the grid extensions? How can you get the demand responses? How can you use, intelligent grids to achieve it? How can you roll out storage? What issue is there of affordability across areas? And also what type of storage? Because there's, of course, hydrogen, there's hydro, there's batteries, etc., etc. Next slide, please. So altogether, we put a PAC scenario in 2 words and one punctuation mark. We say it works. And can you just press click, please? And so, but what do we need to make it happen? So I just wanted to have a couple of slides on moving from our scenario to how to make it happen. So next slide, please. There's a time delay. Okay, fine. So first of all, we need to put the money where it matters. So, and of course, the answers here will depend on which geographic region you're in. So I've just put some European examples here. Of course, in different parts of the world, it'll be different ones. But at the moment, in the COVID response, we've got what are called the recovery packages, recovery and resilience funds and plans. We have the EU budget. There's other issues like the taxonomy. There's also PCIs, which is sort of projects of common interests, which can either fund good things or bad things. So if we focus on funding the right things, then that is a way of actually accelerating the move towards the carbon neutral grid. We also need to act now and not wait. Use each window of opportunity. As I mentioned, the whole recovery is critical, and it's a huge debate over the next 5 months. And there's also a range of different policies which are coming out on the Green Deal. The offshore wind strategy is clearly important. If we're going to grow this offshore wind, we need to make sure it grows in the right place with the right conditions. Otherwise, you'll just destroy ecosystems there. There's the Fit for 55 package, which includes a reform of the renewables energy regulation, energy efficiency regulation, the ETS, the emissions trading scheme, burden sharing, and so on. So there's a range of different opportunities. Of course, we need to stop funding fossil fuels, and all of you will have seen in the press over and over again the level of funding for fossil fuels that's still there. A lot of the COVID response packages have included support for fossil fuels, and this is not going to be part of the solution, unfortunately. You need to reform economic incentives, because the economy at the moment is been part of the problem leading to climate change. So you need to reform the whole economic incentives so that you have Adam Smith's invisible hand pushing in the right direction. So you do need the carbon taxes, subsidy reform, ETS reform, carbon border tax adjustment mechanism, and so on. There's a lot happening in individual countries, also around the world, but we need to sort of cajole each other to make sure we each make a step forward, because then domestic concerns about competitiveness can be sort of avoided. And then, of course, you need to engage all stakeholders, because it's not just the policymakers, but it's the whole set to make it happen. And we're pulling this together into a policy brief that very soon we should be able to share. We're going to hope to share it today, but my colleague has gone down with Corona for the last 2 weeks, unfortunately. But he's okay. Next slide, please. And just to say what we're thinking about, I mean, the windows of opportunity is, and next slide, yeah. So I'm not expecting you to see all of this. You can press the next button, because there's a thing that comes up. In the European Green Deal, there's a number of windows of opportunity for change in the next year. And what we're trying to do is to be able to share the outputs of our carbon neutral grid into each of these, so that they actually say that, it is possible, we can be more ambitious, we need to invest here and there and the other, we need to have this and that policy to avoid unacceptable trade-offs, and then hopefully through this period it makes a difference. And then the next slide, which is the last one, is the next steps. So of course we need to continue engaging in the wider TYNDP process. As I started off, I mean, we need to have a scenario which is looked at properly, and we've got an open policy of our data. We're happy to share it completely with people. We need to make use of all the policy opportunities. We need to, of course, deepen the scenario. I think the reality is that we need national engagement as well. So if you have national information that can support discussion, national, that would be really good. And then, of course, fundamentally, back to the topic of today's conference, is we need to share experiences of how civil society can help build a carbon neutral world. So we'd be very keen to hear from other countries and regions how you've engaged civil society, and of course we can share our insights as to how civil society here, working with academia or with TSOs, is allowing, or decision makers is allowing a way forward. But of course the work's not done. We hope to get additional supports to continue it. In any case, CAN and EB will be pushing for a carbon neutral scenario, whatever happens. Okay, so that's it. I think I've got 1 second left.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I thought you have 2 different presentations, so that's why I did not introduce you. So in hindsight, Patrick is the Director for EU Policy, and Wendel Trier is the Director of Climate Action Network. So 2 directors who represent many Europeans. I don't know how many people you represent in your organizations, but probably several hundred, if not thousands. 30
million.
I mean, yeah, members, but I mean, just the staff alone is quite significant. And I think that's a very sort of impressive sort of exercise, and it should also be an interesting piece of experience for other countries. And I don't have any questions left. There's only one question. Which are the NGOs representing the concerns of those left behind? I mean, that's one question. I don't really know in what context that is. I'm just reading that out.
Well,
yeah.
I think, I think both, I mean, Wendel and I probably have the same answer, because, I mean, we've got 160 members, and those members will, I mean, ours are covering all the environmental fields, as Wendel mentioned, but the issue of the social dimension is quite important to a wide number of our members. So trying to be realistic about sort of energy poverty is something which is sort of the bread and butter of a number of our members on both CAN and our sides. So we do wish that there be no one left behind. I don't know to what extent we've looked specifically at that question within the scenario development, but at least the maybe that could be a future look at in more depth. But but yes, it's core to our ambition. We're not environmentalists who don't take into account the social dimension. We only see that you need the social dimension and equity and fairness to be able to make sure that the Green Deal is actually implemented and fair.
Maybe if I can just
Okay, yeah,
just
Ben?
two words. I mean, a number of our membership are national climate coalitions that, for instance, have amongst their membership trade unions. It's obvious that workers would be affected by the transition, but similarly, we do a lot of work around coal, and where we work on the just transition of coal regions, which often are not the well, if you take away coal, not the richest regions in the countries or in Europe. So we do have quite a bit of attention for this issue of social concerns.
Okay, I think we run a little bit out of time. There is another question which I would suggest we bring in the breakout group, and that's related to the scenario and a very high dominance of both wind and solar. But I think that's a technical debate, and I think we should discuss it in a breakout group. Moving over to our case studies, I think a perfect segue for me right now is to introduce Natasha Natasha Sinclair from the Australian Energy Market Operator. She is the energy systems lead there. And as you probably hear from her accent, I am living in Australia, but I'm not Australian, although I'm trying to be one or get the citizenship very soon. But I'm actually a German, and Australia has the size of the EU, a bit bigger, with a population of Tokyo. We have a presentation now from Australia about renewables and grids and the initiative, and then followed by Japan, and then followed by the EU. So I'm handing over to Natasha from the Australian Energy Market Operator, AMO.
Thanks very much, Sven. I just wanted to confirm that you can hear me okay. Great. So could I have the next slide, please, Duncan? Good morning to everybody, and I am delighted to be speaking to you from Australia. As Ben has introduced me, my name is Natasha Sinclair, and I work for the Australian Energy Market Operator. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the role of the electricity grid in the energy transition and how civil society can help drive that energy transition by being involved in the planning process. Next slide, please. So the national electricity market here covers the 5 eastern states of Australia and our Australian Capital Territory. Just a few facts and figures here, which Sven has helped to set the scene a little bit. The NEM, as it's known, incorporates around 40,000 kilometres of transmission lines and cables, and it supplies about 200 terawatt hours of electricity each year to 10 million customers, so somewhat small in comparison to the European market. AEMO's role is that we are the operator of the NEM, and we also carry out the long-term planning to maintain reliable and secure operation. Now, as part of that planning role, we are required to publish a document every 2 years, which is called the Integrated System Plan. And this is a whole of system plan for the NEM that helps to inform decision makers who are looking at future policy and also investments and regulatory and market reform. And the guiding objective of the ISP, the Integrated System Plan, is to achieve our power system needs of reliability and security at the lowest cost to consumers, while also meeting our policy objectives. Next slide, please. So you will have heard of the energy transition, which is what we're discussing today, and this is happening on many levels across many different industries. So in the electricity business, we are seeing a transition away from coal to increase levels of renewable energy from wind, solar and hydro, and this has been happening for a number of years now here in Australia, similarly to in Europe. And this graph shows our forecast energy mix over the next 20 years. So starting from now in 2020 and looking forward, you can see that the black bars at the very bottom, which represents black coal, is starting to decline, and that is occurring as our aging coal-fired power stations are going to be retired by their operators. And you see that we have in its place an increase in both variable renewable energy from wind and solar, and also dispatchable storage that is going to be required to help us to be able to operate the system safely and securely over that time. So this is really just showing the scale of the change that we're expecting to see over the next 20 years. Next slide, please. So as part of the work for the integrated system plan, we have a number of aspects that we need to consider, such as emissions reductions plans and policies. We look at forecasts for economic growth, market reforms that might be required to help us to maintain the grid during the transition, and also consumer investment that's happening in distributed energy resources over that time. And again, just to give you a feel for some of the figures, the changes we're expecting to see through the next 20 years are up to 15 gigawatts of coal retiring, an increase in distributed energy, such as rooftop solar, of 200%, new variable renewable energy, wind and solar of around 26 gigawatts, and also along with those, the dispatchable resources that are required, anywhere up to 19 gigawatts. Next slide, please. So the integrated system plan produces as its result a plan which we call the optimal development path. And so what you can see here is the eastern side of Australia, and it has in a number of different colours. Each of these lines that you see is a new transmission project that is planned and forecast over these next 20 years. The ISP is important from a network planning perspective because it's really the first stage for many of these network upgrades to be assessed. And it really sets the rules from here as to how the transmission companies will be able to then justify the various individual components of the overall plan. So there's a traffic light system that we use here, going from the green projects, which are called actionable and will be developed over the next 5 to 10 years, through to orange, where we are looking to do a little bit more work and design, which we call preparatory activities before the final investment decisions are made. And the red, which are future projects that are being considered but are not yet required until a later date. And so what you can see overall is that due to the increase in renewables that we're expecting with more wind and more solar, we're going to be needing to have a lot more interconnection across the country to make sure that we can bring all of those, the energy from the VRE into the cities and the major load centres. And also referring back to Antina's presentation, to ensure that we have the diversity and we can make the most of the diversity that we have being spread over such a large geographical area. So if the sun is shining in one part of the country where it's not in the other, we can shift the energy around using the grid, and that's why it's so important. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to talk a bit more about how civil society can help to drive this transition. And moving on, next slide, thanks. So with the ISP, which, as I mentioned earlier, runs every 2 years, is produced every 2 years, we have quite a significant program of stakeholder consultation across that period of time. And the slide that you can see here is showing the various engagement opportunities that we had over the last 2 years before the 2020 ISP was published just in July, just gone. You can see here that the various different icons represent publications, which are shown in the red, and workshops, which are shown in the blue, as well as some various webinars that were held along the way, and also updates that were issued regularly to make sure that people could keep up with the progress of the planning. So the process initially started out with consultation on scenarios, inputs and assumptions, and you've heard a couple of the speakers earlier talking about scenarios, and similarly we in Australia use up to 5 scenarios in our planning process, and we had significant consultation where the result of one or 2 of those sessions was that another additional scenario was included quite early on in the piece to really make it a little bit more ambitious and take that further step out in terms of emissions reduction. So that was a positive outcome from the involvement of our stakeholders. And you can see that we held in early 2020 a series of 3 workshops over a couple of days across different capital cities in Australia, which allowed people to provide commentary on our draft integrated system plan, which we then took on board, and we actually asked for people's feedback in terms of what would be the priority of different modelling work that they would like to see included in the final few months of modelling before the final ISP was produced in July. Next slide, please. So early on in the ISP process, we held a workshop to help us to identify the best locations for what we called candidate renewable energy zones, or REZs. We started with the resource maps such as these, looking at wind and solar across the country, and we asked people to help us to define the criteria that could be used to define and rate the potential areas for siting clusters of renewable energy generation. Next slide. So the result of this process was that 10 factors were selected, including resource quality, land cover and others that you can see here. And the resulting weighted maps were then used to define up to 35 candidate renewable energy zones that you can see in the map on the right. And these candidate zones were used as inputs for our ISP modelling. A large number of these were then actually selected and became part of that optimal development path that I showed you earlier with the grid plan overlaid. And you can see that each of the circles here represents a proposed renewable energy zone, which is a mix of solar and wind. So we're very fortunate here to have such strong quality resources. Next slide. So as I mentioned, after the draft ISP was issued, we did have workshops with a large range of stakeholders, and we really encourage people from a variety of backgrounds to be involved. This included generators, network service providers, retailers, government, consumer groups and civil society groups. And we took the feedback that we received from these workshops, and our management team then had weekly meetings where we stepped through many hundreds of suggestions that were received during these workshops and filtered those through so that we could apply them as best as possible in the modelling work. Next slide, and last one. So in conclusion, AEMO really encourages all stakeholders from many different backgrounds to be involved in the ISP planning process. And in order to do that, probably the best place for people to start if people are interested to find out more is on our website, and I've included a link here where we try to publish as much of the information as possible for the integrated system plan, and we are already now starting on our next 2-year cycle with consultation for the 2022 ISP, and so we're looking forward to again having involvement along the way. So I'll hand it back to Sven. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Natasha. That was also on the minute. Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I particularly like the sort of the traffic light map where you say green is sort of on the go, yellow is a bit further ahead, and red is sort of in the future. Really like that presentation and the whole process. Just for those not familiar with the Australian electricity system, the rest of Australia, which is not the NEM, the East Coast, still has electricity. There is a Swiss grid, which is not the Swiss with double S, which is in Switzerland, but only with one S, which means the South-West interconnected system, which is Western Australia from Perth. But this is not connected with the East Coast, and the Northern Territory is basically a very large microgrid where the cities are more or less on their own. Okay, I wanted to bridge the gap till I actually have questions. Is there any? There's one question, and Tina's question was, how did you get hold of the stakeholders that you involved?
Oh yes, thank you, and Tina. That's a good question. I guess we have had a history of involvement with a number of different groups over the years, and so we have gradually built up a contact list, if you like, or a distribution list for anything relating to the ISP. We publish, as I mentioned, and as is shown on my my last slide here, we publish a lot of information on our website. So that's certainly one way that people can find us, and there's the opportunity for them to register for our distribution list through the website. So I guess people come to us from a number of different sources. We also have various communications and newsletters that go out from our AEMO communications hub, and again we include links and so on there that people can make sure that they get involved, and then they would be notified about any of our upcoming engagement activities once they're onto that distribution list.
Thank you. I have another question before we move over to the Japanese perspective, and that's any tips and ideas how citizens should approach the energy companies to get involved. So to turn it around a bit, the question for Natasha, did you get asked before you invite the people to actually contribute to the process, or so who started basically? Who started the process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess we get a bit of both, but often it's more the stakeholder themselves that reaches out to us and contacts us in one of a number of ways. So we haven't necessarily directly gone out and approached certain groups, but that's something that I think we would certainly like to look further into, especially having seen Antina's very informative presentation early on today. But yeah, generally we find that people do tend to approach us, as I say, through having seen articles or information, or if a particular concern has come up along the way.
Great, thank you. There's one more question which I would like to also move into the breakout rooms, because it's a very technical question, and the answer could actually take up half an hour. The question is how the interconnection between cities, how much increases the flexibility and increase the possibility to integrate more renewables in terms of percentage. That's a very technical question, which we don't have a standard answer, because it depends very much on where you are in terms of what resources you have. So I would like to hand over to Teruo Ono from TEPCO, from the power grid company in Japan. And I think the only sort of common thing between the Australian grid and the Japanese grid is that there are two parts which sort of not really interconnected. There is a 60 hertz and a 50 hertz part in the Japanese grid. With this, I would like to hand over to Teruo Ono, and I wrote down that he is the Deputy General Manager at TEPCO.
Thank you very much, Sven. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Teruo Ono of TEPCO Power Grid. We have 10 T&D companies in Japan. We are one of them, serving the area around Tokyo. I will talk about the grid planning and stakeholder engagement in Japan. I'm currently in the business planning office and involved in this type of discussions from the business perspective. I was in charge of system operations until recently, so I was also involved in this type of discussions from the technical side. Please go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. I first talk about the flow of the grid planning in Japan. We have the government policy, including the future energy mix target in the most upstream. It is discussed and established in the government committee. Basically, all the documents and minutes are disclosed on the web. The committee receives public comments in order to involve general public in the process. And next, the long-term cross-regional network development policy is discussed and established in OCTO's committee. Also, the committee receives public comments. Here, OCTO is Organization for Cross-Regional Coordination of Transmission Operators. It is an organization that plays an important role in the promotion of cross-regional management of electrical businesses in Japan. These committees are composed of members from various sectors, including representatives of stakeholders such as academia, legal, consumer, and energy. Energy, I mean generators, retail, and T&D. And then these policies are followed by the network development plan and individual plan for each transmission line, substation, and so on. We hold public hearings for the individual plan for people living at the location. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. I touched on the government policy, including the future energy mix in the last slide. The target energy mix in 2030 was established in 2015, considering we call 3E+S. It's energy security, economic efficiency, environment, and safety. The figure in the slide shows the current situation and the target energy mix in 2030. Photovoltaics already reached the target, and the wind is also very close to the target. Discussions have just started to update the government policy in the committee last month. I guess the target energy mix will be updated this time. Next slide, please. I mentioned that the long-term cross-regional network development policy is developed based on the government policy, and the network development plan is developed based on it. We call these two as master plan. Current long-term cross-regional network policy was established in 2017. It is updated approximately every 5 years. The discussion was started to update the master plan in August this year. The discussion includes the framework to support the master plan, such as periodic assessment of network development plan, cost-benefit analysis, congestion management, and asset management. For the energy mix and master plan, I believe various groups in Japan are performing scenario studies and simulations, as many speakers talked about today. I think these study results will be included in future discussions. Next slide, please. Okay, from here, I will talk about recent changes and discussions, expected changes in the committees. The first one is the transition from pull to push. We have been doing the grid planning according to the each connection application. We call it pull in the committees. What we are discussing now is that we need to change this practice to push to achieve the large integration of renewable energy while limiting the public burden. What we are discussing now, sorry. Here, push means that we perform the grid planning based on the generation potential. More in detail, what we have been discussed as shown in the slide as A, B, and C. I will explain A and B in the next slides. Please go to the next slide. This slide explains A in the previous slide. The figure in this slide shows the current practice. We start the connection study when we receive an application of the connection study from generator A as shown in the figure. After some time, before we respond to generator A, we may receive an application from another generator, generator B in this figure. This may change conditions for the connection study for generator A, and the response to generator A could be delayed by that. Also, there may be an application from another generator, generator C in this figure. At this stage, generators A and B are doing feasibility studies for themselves, but the condition could be affected by the connection. So I think this is already done in some countries, but by inviting connection applications for the individual reinforcement for a certain period, the connection study can be done considering
diese Sehenswürdigkeiten, die sind doch immer noch dieselben. Schwedoggan und sowas.
Could someone yeah. I think you're back.
Okay, can I continue?
Else on the microphone.
Okay, so I think this is already done in some countries, but by inviting connection applications for the individual reinforcement for a certain period, the connection study can be done considering the generation potential in the area. This will lead to more systematic and efficient process. Please go to the next slide. Yes, the next item is how to secure the connection capacity for offshore wind farms. In order to introduce more offshore wind farms, the competitive bidding process will be introduced for specific areas in Japan. When an offshore wind developer without a connection right wins in the competitive bidding, the right is transferred to the successful bidder. When an offshore wind, but there can be some problems. First one is that the transfer process could be complicated. However, if all the bidders with wind farm developers try to acquire the transmission capacity for the farm connection, other generators, generator C in this figure, cannot acquire the farm connection rights until the bidders release their rights. In order to solve the problem, the government will acquire the connection capacity for the offshore wind farm in advance based on the wind farm capacity for the competitive bidding. Next slide, please. Another topic that has been discussed is the transition from first come, first served basis to the merit order basis. The transmission capacity is currently allocated to generators on the first come, first served basis in Japan. After the whole capacity is allocated, generators can apply for the non-farm connection. Under this rule, however, cheaper or more environmentally friendly generators may need to reduce their outputs due to the non-farm connection. The discussion was started in July this year to study the possible congestion management after the transition from the first come, first served basis to the merit order basis. It is still under discussion, but it is highly likely that the redispatch by T&D companies like us will be a short-term solution to be adopted. Next slide, please. Yes, yes. This final slide shows the schedule of the master plan. The master plan is expected to be established in spring 2022, together with the supporting framework. When each supporting framework is established, it will be applied to the actual operation even before the establishment of the master plan. Thank you very much. I'll give it back to Sven. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really comprehensive overview. Thank you very much. I'm looking for questions, and until we have some, or if we don't have, I have a question. If the process of sort of the bidding process, what you described, is that embedded into a more sort of long-term vision where sort of the time steps are clearer, let's say in 10, 15, 20 years? Or is it more more focus on the short term? That's one. And the second one is there any discussion about distribution grid planning as well? Because if solar comes online, that's quite often distribution grid.
Okay, thank you very much. And for the first question, currently we have only short-term bidding processes. So I believe we have identified 4 locations that could be good for the offshore wind farm. So we are starting with the bidding process for these locations. So, but in the future, I think more locations will be specified by the government. But at this moment, we are only looking at the very short-term process. And the second question for the distribution grids, yes. As I already mentioned, we have many photovoltaics installed in the distribution, connected to the distribution grids. So we have a lot of updates to the upgrades to the distribution grid is necessary. So many T&D companies in Japan are spending a lot for the distribution upgrades. And I think the main situation here is that the overloading problem and the voltage problems. So I think for the overloading problems, distribution grids are being upgraded. And for the voltage problem, I think we need to install more controlling devices, like equipment and the monitoring equipment.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We have still no questions. Maybe we have also time in the breakout group for that. Just before we move over to the last case study from the European perspective, just a short question with the, maybe you can just give us a very short answer. Japan just pledged net zero by 2050. And does that already, I mean, that's just a recent announcement. Does that affect already the future of the planning process in Japan? Because I assume there will be a lot coming in.
Yeah, I think it should, but at this moment, no. But many people talk about it, and it should be included in that kind of consideration soon.
Great. Okay. I need help from the technical team. Is Dante Powell from NGOs now there? I'm not sure because it's supposed to.
Yes, he's here.
Here we go. I see you. Thanks, Dante. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Dante Powell from NGOs. We talked a lot about NGOs, so I think I don't need to explain what NGOs is. Dante, over to you.
Okay, no problem. Is it possible to share my screen?
It should be possible. Can you click share screen at the bottom of the window here on Zoom?
Just underneath your own video.
It's in a green button that says share screen.
Okay. Yeah, I got it.
Great.
Sorry, I have many screens. I just need to move them around.
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay. Can you see? Okay. So, so yeah, we've spoken a lot about the TYNDP and the scenarios that we do in the TYNDP. It's probably just worth giving a little bit of background to what we're trying to achieve with these scenarios. So the scenarios are designed for the TYNDP assessment. So this was the original kind of target for the TYNDP scenarios. For the TYNDP scenario. So it's an infrastructure assessment for both the gas and the electricity TSOs. And then finally, really the end goal of the TYNDP scenarios is to allow funding from the PCI process, which is given by the European Commission. And this funding is actually relevant for both the electricity and the gas side. So what we kind of look at is, will energy production develop in a centralized or a decentralized way? And this way we produce two different contrasting scenarios. One is the distributed energy, one is a global ambition. How can we be sure that the infrastructure supports the development? Because we always have this kind of chicken and egg problem. Do you install the infrastructure first and leave the generation units to come, or do you install the generation units to come and then install the infrastructure? One of the main things that we look at is, are we going to be ready for Green Deal developments? In our previous scenarios, it was a little bit uncertain because we didn't really know what the Green Deal would look like. But the purpose of the scenario is to ensure that we're ready in the European space for the Green Deal targets. And then we can then see, okay, what is the grid development required in order to kind of facilitate this transition? And then, of course, we need to look at the delivery of security of supply. So can we meet our security of supply? Can we meet our adequacy targets? Does it include market integration? What kind of competition does it usher? So in the end, the scenarios are meant for analyzing information, and they're not really meant as a prediction or forecasting. We try to look at three ends of the spectrum. And our scenarios are really meant to be somewhere in between these three ends of the spectrum. So they're complementary to the long-term strategy, and we do take some inputs from the long-term strategy from them. But we just really focus on infrastructure here. So we really just try to focus on, based on these, what will the needs be for infrastructure for these contrasted future? We have a big development team, and the scenario, of course, the first route to the TYNDP, we have quite a huge development team, which includes 90 gas TSOs, and both comprising from the gas and electricity side. We have 30 regional teams from gas and electricity, and we work together to achieve common EU targets. And the kind of selling points that we have is that we use ethics, so we're committed to economic welfare. We try to take the national relevance. So one thing that's important is to actually see what each of the TSOs are planning in their own member states, join those together, and then see, okay, once we do this, are we still on target? Are we still hitting the mark? There's room for innovation. We have a lot of expertise coming from our stakeholders, and also we have quite a lot of stakeholder engagement that we try to engage with as many stakeholders as possible. We do a consultation, and we've taken back a lot of feedback from the consultation, not just on different technologies, but we've also had some feedback for grid as well. And we did some updates to the scenario. So we actually realigned the grid for our scenarios. We reran our models. We redid our biomass, and essentially we tried to take in as much as possible the stakeholder feedback that was given to us by the members of the European energy space. So yeah, I guess the main kind of area of our scenario that is the main focus is achieving the of the different storylines. So mainly the Paris Agreement storyline. And again, looking at grid, what is the generation mix that we need in order to meet these targets, in order to meet decarbonization, in order to decarbonize at the 1.5 degrees with the 66.7% probability, and then what grid is required to usher this in. So we should mention that when we assess in the TYNDP, we do three things. So the first thing is we do a grid analysis for the actually in the scenario. So we do this grid analysis to look at what kind of grid expansion is required in order to make sure that you can the electricity can flow naturally and unrestricted through Europe. Then the second thing is it goes through the TYNDP and it goes into a process called the identification of system needs. And with this project, we kind of try to look at what is the need for grid when you look at the market on a more granular level. So we split up the bidding zones into smaller, let's say, areas. And then we look at what is the need for infrastructure between these smaller areas. And then the final is the CBA, so cost benefit analysis. So we have projects that go into the cost benefit analysis, and then we essentially see real projects in Europe. What are the benefits of these projects? Will they go through to the PCI process, and will they get funding? Unfortunately for this, we don't do this for 2040 and 2050. But in the next TYNDP, in the next scenario building phase, we will be looking to expand even to 2050 to try to get a little bit of an insight into what the grid requirements are there. But up until now, we have only really gone up until 2040. And this is just a slide on essentially what the carbon neutrality looks like. So global ambition, distributed energy, and national trends. So the two top-down scenarios reach carbon neutrality by 2050, whereas the bottom-up reaches somewhere between 85 and 95%. So looking at electricity and gas, we first just want to say that we do meet the energy efficiency targets that are dictated under the EU law. We do have a lot of uptake in hybrid heat pumps and electric vehicles. One thing that we didn't do this year is that we didn't take into account the needs for reinforcement for grid in the distribution network. And this is something that we really would like to do this time. And actually, we're in process of speaking with the European distribution network associations to kind of look at, okay, with this uptake of hybrid heat pumps, electric vehicles, what will actually be the requirements for the distribution networks in the future? We know that there's going to be a huge uptake, and I think in a recent presentation I saw by Eurelectric that 70% of the resources will be in the distributed network. And we believe that in 2021 there should actually be need for a distribution network TYNDP, which will start also from our TYNDP, which will start from the, let's say, the same place. So there should be some sort of agreement between the DSOs, NSOE and NSOG. And in this project, we're really going to delve a little bit deeper into what the energy transition means for the distributed networks. So rather than just having the whole holistic EU view, we want to look a little bit into these networks as they're going to be critical for the energy transition. So this is one thing that we definitely need to start looking a little bit more in when you're looking at the European transmission and the entrance of new technologies like electric vehicles and heat pumps. This is the final generation that we see. So you see that there's actually going to be quite a huge electricity demand, which will go up to 6,700 terawatt hours. In order to ensure that these flows are properly distributed around Europe, we see in the latest IOSN that you're actually going to need quite a huge amount of grid, at least on the bidding zone level. We do have studies which go down into a little bit deeper level, but what we really look at is the bidding zone level for the scenarios. And then another thing which will be very important in the future is looking at the sector coupling space. So this is going to require a more of an interaction between the electricity and the gas grids. And also, again, in the previous scenarios, we didn't look so much at what the needs for infrastructure is for the sector coupling, for the power to X. But in the next scenarios, we are trying to look a little bit more at what the need for grid will be once you enter the power to gas and power to liquids into the market. So we're looking at both hydrogen grids, and then we're looking at electricity grids as well. But as you can see here, in 2040, in the distributed energy scenarios, you see that there's almost 1,500 terawatt hours of generation, which is required just for power to X. So what we need to look at now is, of course, there will be need to transfer flows throughout Europe to transfer that renewable energy to create that green gas and to create those green fuels. But there's also going to be need for the hydrogen grid as well. So what we're trying to do at the moment now is see what is the interaction between the electricity grid, but there's definitely going to be a big need for a whole new infrastructure as well, which will interact with the electricity grid and will work in synergy with the electricity grid. And this is something that we want to explore a little bit more in the next coming scenario building phase. Maybe we don't need to go too much on the gas demand and the gas supply mix, but looking at the interlinked model, you see that there's going to be more and more need for interaction and low carbon energy sources in order to push through this decarbonization and push through this energy transition. And again, another thing, the reason that we're going to need so much grid and so much interaction is we're trying to really, in both scenarios, we're trying to reduce our energy imports to the minimum that they can be. And I think I have 1 more minute left. So if you see where we are now, where you have predominantly oil imports and a lot of methane imports, we're trying to completely we're trying to at least half what you see here. And in distributed energy, it's completely almost eradicated. But that means that this energy that we once got imported will have to be replaced by something else. And the main energy vectors that they're going to be replaced by is going to be electricity and hydrogen. So in these senses, we need to make sure that as these technologies increase, as these needs for new generation capacity increases, we will also be considering grid. And this is when we look into the TYNDP and the CBA phase, which really describes exactly the grid that we need. I hope I didn't go over too much, but that was the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Dante. That's really interesting, really exciting to hear that the gas grid, the power to X, and the distributed grid will actually come into the picture for the new TNYDP.